Careful, I didn't even see what she was doing with it. I mean, you know, they must have when they were upstairs or something. But
Here. My name's Melissa Bradford, and I'm the chairman of the Liberty Valley School Founders Group. About almost exactly a year ago, Michelle and Wendy and myself got together, and we started putting some publicity together, and slowly but surely, more and more people joined our group, and in the fall, we decided we wanted to open a school in Joliet, and since then, gradually, we've been building in our numbers and in interest and in publicity, and we are very excited about today's event. And we want to thank you all very much for coming. Tonight, we are very lucky to have with us two of the founders of Sudbury Valley School in Framingham, Massachusetts. Sudbury Valley School is the school that we are modeling our school after. We have Hannah Greenberg here and Daniel Greenberg here, which you might have heard him on the radio last night with me. And Daniel tonight is going to give us a talk about, the democratic school and self-initiated learning. Is that it? Daniel and Hannah were part of the group that started Sudbury Valley School 28 years ago. And after Daniel's talk, there will be some time to ask questions. And of course, we have refreshments. We have books available for sale. If you're not yet on our mailing list, you can sign on to our mailing list. If you have not yet received a newsletter, we have copies of our newsletter in the back. So please enjoy yourselves. Feel free to ask questions of us at the end. And now I'd like you all to welcome Daniel Greenberg.
In the last couple of weeks, there have been two splashes of publicity that have involved Sudbury Valley and one of them Liberty Valley. One is an article in the Chicago Tribune which had the marvelous headline, "No Teachers." A woman who happened to be the mother of the city editor of the Middlesex News, which is the regional newspaper in our part of the country, lives in Chicago, saw this article, saw that it referred to Sudbury Valley, sent it to her son and said, "Why don't you do an article about them out there?" Well, of course, Middlesex News has done many articles about us, but he had to satisfy his mom, so he sent out a report and decided to do a big front page spread on us. And his headline was, "Sudbury Valley is school with no rules." So we're now a school with no teachers and with no rules, and I'm expecting the next one to say Sudbury Valley School with no students or something. But what these incidents brought home again and again and again were the difficulty of getting the concept. And it's something that's bothered us and has been puzzling us really from the very beginning. Because, as you'll see, and as the evening develops, the central concept of the Sudbury Valley School idea is the essence of simplicity. And in fact, people who do get it, and I hope everybody here either has or will, realize this very quickly. I mean, it's so simple. It's so simple, and most things that make sense are simple. And yet it's very, very difficult for simple ideas to catch on. And I think that's a historical fact that is puzzling and paradoxical, but nevertheless true. I mean, if you look in the grand scheme of history, and I'm not necessarily comparing us to the examples that I might mention, if you look at the grand scheme of history, really simple ideas that have revolutionized the world, like monotheism, right? That is essentially a simple idea. whether you're religious or atheist doesn't make any difference. You know historically in the history of theology that the idea that there is one supreme ruler of the universe is in its essence much simpler than the pagan models that went before it, which involve not only a multiplicity of deities, but a multiplicity of conflicting areas of interest and an overarching, completely unpredictable role of fate and so forth and so on. It's a really difficult system. And along comes monotheism, which made life so much simpler, and which in fact ultimately displaced paganism, but it was so hard to displace. And even to this day, so many areas of the world have a combination of the two. You know, people who are monotheists, but who have just a little bit of paganism on the side, just in case. It's hard to go for a simple truth. And the same thing happened with science. I mean, the essence of modern science is a very, very simple idea. And it has to do with the idea that reality, that physical reality, is somehow describable in terms of Greek logic and mathematics. And I don't want to go into a whole spiel about this, but that's the simple idea. I mean, how do you describe physical reality? It's terribly, terribly complicated. And if you read physics books and biology books that were written in ancient times or written in the Middle Ages, they're very complicated, very complex, because life is complicated, the world is complicated. You know, along comes a group of people like Galileo and Newton, these great thinkers, and they say, I can reduce, basically I can reduce all of this to something really simple. And it's hard, it's hard. It's hard for an idea like that to catch on. It took centuries. And even today, there's lots and lots of people who have many doubts about, how true this is. And it's difficult, We have a simple idea here. And the simple idea is basically one that comes right out of biology and evolution. And all it is the notion that nature has provided children innately with the drive, need, and desire to become effective adults. That's it. That's all it is. If this really is true, and you have to think about it from an evolutionary point of view, mankind has been around in one form or another, depending on which latest anthropologist you believe, 1 million years, whatever. And, there haven't been any schools around. There haven't been any curriculum reforms until a couple of 100 years. How have we survived? I mean, here we are faced with all of this stuff coming out of the Department of Education, out of state departments of education, governors, God knows who gets together these days to talk about education. And, we all realize that if this latest reform and this latest amount of money and this latest appropriation and this latest curriculum revision and this latest group of assessments isn't immediately established, mankind will fall apart. I mean, there's no future. Nobody will be equipped to handle the future. Nobody will be equipped to be an adult. And it catches you, The complexity catches you. And it's so complex. We need to organize schools here, and more administration, or less administration. How do you do it? Inner city and outer city and suburbs. And my God, by the time it's over, you just realize you have a monumental task. And it's all this tremendous complexity, and you sort of wonder how on earth did the human race make it for 999,000, 900 and whatever years until schools came along. I mean, it's unbelievable that they ever got anywhere, because kids are so inept. And if they don't have just the right schooling, they'll never grow up. It's an obvious, simple reality. It's true of animals. We all know it when we talk about animals. Anybody who studies the animal kingdom knows that. I mean, what happens? Cats don't go to school. Ponies are, no, not ponies, that's the wrong word. What are the little foals, I guess, don't go to school. They get born, they grow up, and somehow nature has endowed them, one way or another, with the mechanisms they need in their own context, in their own ecological environment, to become adults who will survive. And that's what's happened with the human race as well. Now, what I would like to discuss tonight, in greater detail, is what the implications of this really simple, or some of the implications of what this really simple truth are. And that's what I'd like to go over. But I want you to keep in the back of your minds throughout the whole discussion what it is we're talking about, and not get lost. We'll be talking about a lot of things because there's lots of examples, and there's all kinds of things happening on the periphery. Let's not lose sight of the center. And the center is that simple statement that when you have a child, that child, this child, anyone, I don't care what their age is, the babe in arms in the back, the day they're born, they have by nature the necessary tools provided to them to grow up to be effective adults. And we have to understand what the implications are. Now, I'd like to talk about how I see some of these tools. And I'm going to focus on 3 large categories. And I'm very hesitant in many ways to do this because the minute you start doing things like this, you get caught up in numbers games. You know, Howard Gardner wrote about, what is it, the 7 or 9, I forget the latest number, modes of cognition and learning and so forth, and now that's a holy number. You know, all I want to say is, I'm going to divide things into 3. It's a nice small number. It's comfortable to work with. As you'll see, I've subsumed a lot of things in each of the 3 to make it happen as 3. I could have made them 9 or 15. So let's not get hung up on the numbers. But I would like to show you how I see this sort of in broad, in the consequence of this statement in a broad outline. Now, I've never used one of these. I use blackboards every now and then.
Is that why it's facing the other way?
Well, that's why it's facing the other way. And so I'm going to use it today. Flip chart, see? But the reason actually I want to use it is so that I can get to I have 1 on each page, right? And then on the last page, I have all 3. And the reason I want that is because I want all 3 to sort of be there, because we're going to be talking about the consequences of this later. So the first category that I'd like to mention is the first characteristic that children have by nature, as I see it, is that all children have a burning curiosity coupled with model building ability. Let me explain what that means. Curiosity alone isn't enough of a tool. What curiosity does is make you probe, make you look, make you interested in your environment. And of course, everybody knows how interesting the environment is to children and to adults and to normal people. We're all curious all the time. But curiosity isn't quite enough as a survival mechanism because you have to be able to do something with the products of your curious probing. Because if you're just aimlessly probing around, that doesn't get you anywhere. What the probing does is serve as your mechanism for building pictures, what I call models of reality, pictures of the world that enable you to function in the world. Because that's the only way we can actually operate in the world, if we have some idea in our heads of what the world is like. Now, I'm going to talk about the stages of life later, but just imagine for a minute that you have no idea what your environment is like. Say I take you and you have never been in the Central African Republic, okay? And I plunk you down into some remote village, all of you in the Central African Republic. I haven't been there either, right? And there you are. Now, you'll be curious. You better be curious, or you're not going to survive very long. But in addition to being curious, you have to immediately start trying to create a picture of what this reality is that you've been put into. And every single person in this room will create a different picture. It's the same Central African Republic village, but everyone here, guaranteed, will create a separate picture because each of us is going to bring whatever experiences we've had in our life, our pictures of reality, our whole history, and our whole mental process, our whole ability to build models to that event. So that's item number 1. This is an ability that every human being has to probe, to be curious. It's in our nature. And to take the results of this and create out of these probings pictures which we're constantly refining, and we'll talk about this in great detail. Okay. The second characteristic that all human beings have, I will call it, in my list, I'll call the ability to interact with the physical world. I mean, as you see, these are all interrelated. In other words, it's fine to be curious, but how does it work? And one of the ways it works is we have the ability to tune into the physical world, now, through our senses primarily, through our body, and through the interpretations that we apply to the sensory inputs. That's very important, because the exact configuration of senses that we have colors the way we see the world. You know, if we smelled better, we'd have a different world. If we heard different frequencies, we'd have a different world. If we saw different visual frequencies, we'd have a different world. We have a certain set of ways that enables us to interact with the world. They determine a lot of how we create, how we proceed into adulthood. And again, we'll go into that in detail in a minute. The third thing we all have, in addition to being able to interact with our senses, is the ability to interact with other people. And that's a little different. Of course, that happens through the senses, but it's set apart from that because it involves mutually interactive relationships, and it involves a different level of inputs than straight, direct physical inputs that we get from our senses. Now, these three tools, which I will leave here, curiosity model building, the ability to interact with the physical world, and the ability to interact with people, are what I will handle today as sort of the basic equipment that nature gives us that enables us to function as people and enables kids who have all of these to become effective adults. And this is how I want to proceed. What I'd like to do is I'd like to look at these three modalities, three abilities or skills or whatever you want to call it, at three different phases of life. I want to look at what these mean in infancy. I want to look at what these mean in adulthood today. And then, when we've got the extremes, and we sort of have a positioning here, I want to discuss what these three imply for the intervening period, the so-called school-age period as we see it today. So that's my plan for how to proceed this evening. So let me begin with infancy. And let's see how do these manifest themselves in infants, and what kind of implications do they have for infants? Well, of course, we all know about the curiosity of infants, but one of the things that I think people overlook is the method by which infants build models through their curiosity. What is the mechanism by which infants do this? And I'd like to sort of, those of you who have very tiny children, I'd like you to sort of, or have had very tiny children, I'd like to sort of go back and focus on this for a minute and sort of put yourself in the position, a very specific position. You have a very small child, for example, who, and this is lying on the floor. I don't want to give you an age, but you can put your own age. This is lying on the floor, and a child is on the floor, perhaps crawling around. You're near it. What happens if this is something the child has never seen? Invariably, the child picks it up. The child feels it. The child turns it over. The child looks at it, stares at it. The child puts it in his mouth or her mouth. Always in the mouth, right? That's a very, very important sensory organ. The texture, feels textures. Every texture is different to a little child. I don't know, it's fascinating to watch when you see it in detail. Plastic, rugs. You ever seen kids sort of play with rugs? It's the first time they ever see it. Ooh, this is different. Paper? Ooh, that paper's different again. Plastic, every one of these things. What's happening here? Why are they doing this? They're trying to understand what their inputs mean and put them into some kind of a picture, make sense out of them. How can a child make sense out of something like this the first time he or she sees it? I mean, think about it. It's mind-boggling. You have no experience whatsoever. You're a few months old, you have no experience whatsoever, and you come across this object. There's nothing to put it into. It's just, it's an enormous challenge. No, it's a much bigger challenge to figure out how to do algebra if you're a teenager. Much bigger. Because there's no clue. You don't have a framework, a model building framework yet to position this into. And so you're working and working and working, and that's what I want you to focus on. This thing that the child does that in most child development books is sort of, I don't know, it's passed over in a sense. I mean, everybody talks about it. Yes, children will do this, they'll pick up things, they'll put them in their mouth, they'll feel them. It's sort of a list and sort of who cares. But that isn't the thing. The thing is that this is hard work. This is mind-blowingly hard work. It's intense concentration. It's focusing. And it's model building at its highest form because there are no reference points and no starting points. For us to be put into Central African Republic is a zillion times easier because we have so many concepts: shelter, homes, clothing, food. All these things are in our gestalt, however we put it together. But where does this fit? Where does a key fit? Where does a spoon fit? A plate, anything. The second thing that you have to understand is that in addition to this kind of hard work, which is going on all the time, children use play. Now I'm talking about before they get involved with other children. We're not yet on interacting with other kids even. Children use play as part and parcel of this model building, and it's essential to it. And by play, I mean any activity that doesn't have a known outcome a priori. That's how I define play. Play is a free activity which is not leading to an endpoint that is known in advance. Part of what kids do, why do they keep coming back to this stuff? You know, they can play with this, I've used the word already and I shouldn't have. See, they can interact with this object for day after day after day until they've reached a certain point where it's been totally integrated into their being. What do they do with it? They toss it around. They turn it, they try this side of it, this side of it, this side of it. What they're doing is they're putting this into different modalities all the time. That's play. They don't know what it's going to lead to. They look at this and a child turns it over. He doesn't know what it's going to look like on the other side. And then he turns it over again and then turns it this way and then turns it that way. See, I'm not talking about trivial things. I'm talking about the essentials of how children form their view of the world. And play, this free-form handling is central to it. The other thing I want to say about children, which is often overlooked, is the degree of concentration that they bring to this. From the earliest age, children are unbelievably focused and concentrated beings. That's what they are. That's their nature. The biggest problem parents have with children, I don't care what your method of child rearing is, that we are constantly interrupting their activities, their focused activities, whatever they are. You know, they want to do something. If they're 2 months old, if they're 10 months old, if they're a year old, doesn't make any difference. They're doing something. We want to do something else. We pick them up, we say this, we soothe them, we do nice things, but the fact of the matter is we bug them because they have been into something. They're terribly concentrated. And the minute you realize this, you know, your whole attitude towards child rearing has to change. It doesn't mean you're not going to take care of your own needs. It doesn't mean that you're only going to do what the kid is doing. But once you realize that, by God, this is just a little child, it's so, you know, all this little child stuff. It isn't just a little child doing little child things. This is a human being intensely focused on activities that are central to its survival. And it doesn't like to be messed with when it's trying to survive. Now, once you realize that, then you can adjust yourself to it. You understand? You can say, okay, I'm sorry to interrupt with your survival activities here right now, but, you know, I've got to go to the bathroom. Okay, fine. But but at least you understand what you're doing. Okay? And you can understand the same thing. I mean, again, try to think of it as an adult. It's the same kind of thing. You know, we're always polite about that. Like, excuse me, I have to leave the meeting now. Can we just wait 1 minute? You know, we don't take that trivially, but with kids, we don't see it. Okay, let me talk about this in infancy and in childhood. The importance of this, of interacting with the physical world in infancy, can be seen best if you think about the child's drive to mobility. because we all know how they want to touch things. But children are frantically eager to be mobile. Why? Ask yourself why. What is this great, everything's fine, here I am, I'm, 4 months old, I'm sitting here, people are feeding me. Hey, it's a great life, Put me down, change me, and I'm wet. Why do I have to move? I don't ever have to move. It's a great life. All my needs are taken care of. I don't even have to earn a living. I get it all. Clothes, the whole works. Grandparents come to little me. Everything is terrific, right? And yet there has never been a kid born who doesn't have, God forbid, a terrible physical handicap, who hasn't readily, eagerly, enthusiastically given up his or her lack of mobility for movement. They're desperate to crawl. How hard it is to crawl. Again, think about crawling, because it's going to be important to us when we talk about school. Think about crawling. Again, try to go out. I'm very lucky in this. Now, I remember noticing this with our own children, but we're very lucky to have a grandchild now living with us at home. And we watched this young man learn how to crawl. And it was a good lesson, because I hadn't seen it in a while. I've seen it on other people's kids, but now we had this a refresher course, Oh my God, is it hard to crawl? It's so hard to crawl. You've got to coordinate 4 limbs. You've got to move them all, and you've got to get them moving in a way that propels you. Some kids never learn how to crawl. Some kids go straight, and happen in our family. Some kids go straight to walking. It's, I can't figure this out. Looks easier what they're doing, standing up on 2 feet. Never get this, only 2 limbs there, They're wrong about that, but still. And then a lot of them go backwards. You know how many kids learn how to crawl. Oh my God, it happened to our grandson. He started moving backwards. He wants to go forward. He wants that cup, and he's doing all this stuff, and he's going back. So then he learns how to, then somehow by accident, he turns, Well, this was so ingenious. He learned to combine turns and backward motion into forward propulsion. That's like tacking. That's like tacking, Here's the wind coming this way and the boat is going that way, Imagine how long it took human race to figure out how to move against the wind in a sailboat, It's weird. So the point is that this need to explore the world, which then of course becomes, you start walking and all that stuff, the need to use your body, to use it as an active explorer, as an active interactor with the world, is absolutely central to human beings and is an essential survival mechanism. And they've got it through and through, and they express it, of course. We all know kids like to romp, they like to run. How many kids like to walk? This is the most common thing in Sudbury Valley. Of all things, the most common infraction of rules in Sudbury Valley is don't run. And the most common thing that you find is not the teenagers. That happens sometimes when they're sort of rowdy and stuff. But you say don't run, and they sort of, the rule, and they sort of laugh and they slow down. But with kids under the age of, 9 or 10, it invariably is the same thing. Don't run. I'm not running. Wait a minute. You were running. No, I'm not. Well, don't run. Okay. They're not running. They have absolutely no idea. They can't wait to get there. What kid walks if he can run? I gotta get there. They don't even think of it as running. They don't get tired. We go, we're tired of running. We can't get there. Little kids run all over the place, and they're not tired. We're dropping off our feet. Let's talk about interaction with people in infancy and in younger ages. That, to me, is one of the most remarkable things. And I want to focus on a feature of it that I don't think has been brought sufficiently to the fore. See, the question is, what's the survival value? What's the point of interacting with other people? Because we can understand, so far we've understood the rest. We know why you need to explore, we know why you need to build models, we know why you need to interact with the physical world. What's the real survival value of communicating with other people and interacting with them and learning how to be social with them. And there's a lot of theories on that. Some of the more common theories being things like lots of tasks get done better if they're done cooperatively. You know, there's certain things you just can't do alone. Building big things or doing big enterprises or sometimes need cooperation of a lot of people, all that stuff. And none of that is wrong. But I don't find it satisfying enough. Because, you know, let's face it, we go through life. How many times do any of us do things that absolutely require other people to help us in its execution? Not that often. Honey, help me move the table. I can't move it alone. Let's open it together, you know, or whatever. Or help me carry this heavy box down. Sure, you know. But, and of course, if you're building, you know, an airplane or something, but that wasn't too much of a concern back then. What is, there has to be more to it than that. And I think there is a more to it than that. A really central more to it than just the question of having cooperation. And it's this. Somewhere along the line, an infant comes to the realization that the other creatures about him, I have to apologize for using the masculine when I mean him or her, and the feminists will please take me to task in the question period. At some point, an infant will suddenly come to the realization that the other people around him are like him. I mean, the idea that, you know, self-consciousness, the idea of self-awareness, the idea that I'm a person and you're a person. Very, very complicated idea. I have no concept as to how this happens. The whole question of how human beings become self-aware is one of the burning issues in psychology. Nobody has a clue. Nobody has a clue. I mean, there's lots of theories, but nobody really knows. Nobody knows why animals are or aren't self-aware. There are even debates about whether they are or aren't. And there are fascinating experiments to show that some chimpanzees are and some aren't and so forth. But the fact of the matter is every human being becomes self-aware at a certain point. And more importantly, becomes aware that there are other selves like him. Now, this has tremendous consequences that go way beyond cooperative stuff. Because a kid knows instinctively, an infant knows instinctively that he's struggling to understand the world. He knows that because it's his daily bread. One of the things that comes through when we interact with an infant all the time is slowly starts dawning on him, and I don't know, or maybe suddenly, that other people have the same struggle. Other people have tried to figure out the world, and other people have figured out something about the world. And the biggest advantage to children communicating with adults or with older people, the biggest advantage is that it's like plugging into a whole other brain that has already done a lot of this work and utilizing the results of that other brain's work to help your own work. It's almost unbelievably miraculous. Here I am struggling, and what do we do as parents? I mean, that's what we're constantly doing as parents. We're constantly, and as adults around children, we're constantly interacting with them, talking to them in ways that explain the world to them. Even when we're not being didactic as teachers, you know, that's just what we're doing all the time. Here, have a glass of milk. What does here have a glass of milk mean? You know, I mean, what does it mean to a kid? The whole idea, here, wouldn't you like some broccoli? Or wouldn't you like, you know, to have this? Or let's go outside. Now, all of these things are being talked to with the kid, but the kid at some point is figuring out, my goodness, you know, here's somebody who's figured out things about food, figured out things about the outdoors, figured out things about this, figured out things about that. If I could plug into their brains, if I could understand what they're saying, I'm mind expanding. You know, I've literally expanded the capacity of my mind to understand. Now, I want to make it very clear. I'm not talking here about a conscious thing. I'm not talking about, you know, this 1-year-old or 1.5-year-old, you know, sitting down like I am and saying, oh, if I plug into somebody else's brain, I'll be a lot smarter. I'm talking about a survival mechanism. Something that every kid has, and something that enables the human race to do something phenomenal, which is to use collective wisdom and collective knowledge, each and every one of us individually, as well as all of us as a group. And this this is so powerful that I can't even begin. I mean, if you want to understand what differentiates people from other creatures, start there. We can pool our wisdom. We can pool our model building. And no other animal that we know of can do it, at least not as effectively as we can, or even close to it. So as far as I can see, this is what makes it absolutely essential, because a child, when a child of 1 or 1.5 or 2 is learning how to talk, they're not thinking, oh, it'll be good for me to learn how to talk so we can move a table together, or so we can build a ship together. They can't project into the future about, collective things that a lot of people do. But what they can see is the immediate gain that's gained by me being able to look at my mother and figure out, oh my God, she's figured something out, and I can actually clue into it. And again, I want to point to this in concluding this. I want to point to this. The task of learning to communicate with other people, the task of speech, which is what we're really talking about, the task of plugging it, because again, I don't have time to go into the details of what speech is about, but you understand this. Speech is our way of communicating what's in here to somebody else. This task of speech is something that children all pursue doggedly. It is spectacularly complex. Nobody has a clue as to how it's done. There's many theories around hardwiring, non-hardwiring, programming, this and that. Nobody knows. The fact is we have it. The human race has it, and we know how to do it, and kids do it with a vengeance. They just have to do it. And furthermore, it's even more than that. If they're in a home where there's different people who talk different languages, they'll pick them all up. If they're in a home where the mother talks French and the father talks English, and that's the only language they talk, the kid will talk French and English. I mean, right away. At 2, at 3. They don't get dyslexia later. I mean, all of Europe doesn't have dyslexia. Most Europeans have several languages. They just talk different languages because they want to tie into these people. They want to understand. And to them, it's just, oh, that's how I plug into him, with a oui and a non, and this one yes and no, and that's all. That's the way I plug in. Okay, I've said what I want to say about infancy, and now I want to completely turn over and go to adulthood. Adulthood in the modern world. Let's see how these relate to the adult situation in the current postmodern world. Now, I have to say this. This is crucial, because all of these modes are perfectly normal adult modes in pre-industrial society. I don't even want to talk about it. They're perfectly, anybody who talks about pre-industrial society, tribal society, will understand this. It's all there, and I really don't want to spend any time. If people want to elaborate it in questions and answers, we can talk about it later. Now, something happened. This is a little detour. Something happened in the industrial era. And in the industrial era, what happened was, we have to understand this because it's a little bizarre. What happened in the industrial era was, we sort of got out of sync. The human race sort of got out of sync. What happened was there were some really smart people, very creative people, who figured out ways that you could better the living conditions of lots and lots of people and produce a lot of material goods if you introduced, for lack of a better word, the factory system. Okay? These were creative people. These were extremely imaginative people, brilliant innovators, inventors, and so forth. They figured this out, but they couldn't figure out computers. They just couldn't, you can't blame them. Which means that they couldn't figure out ways to make all the repetitive, routine actions happen on their own. That's an accident of history. As far as I can see, somebody might have invented computers first, and then invented, machines that make, oh, hey, we've got computers now. All we have to do is hook these up to to an old lady weaving, and we've got something that makes clothes. No, it didn't happen that way. People looked at the old lady weaving, and they made these complicated machines to throw shuttles through and work on gears and work on this and work on that, each of which needs hundreds of people to man it, and that's what happened in history. So look at the position the human race was in there for just about 100 years. which is nothing in history, but there was. You know, you got all this great stuff that you can produce, lots of food, lots of clothes, better shelter, wood, you know, instead of sawing it, you put it through a sawmill, all this stuff. But in order to do it, you have to have an army of machines, people machines, to man it. And the people who invented this, and unfortunately got us into this situation, were themselves very creative people. And they had a problem. And we all had a problem. And everybody was conscious of the problem in the beginning of the 19th century. How are we going to work this thing? Because people don't like to be machines. I mean, everybody knew that. Nobody likes to be a machine. You can make people slaves. You can do this. You can beat them. But how do you make them a machine? And I mean a machine. Look at Charlie Chaplin's, you know, Modern World. You know what I'm talking about. Everybody should rent that film and look at it. I absolutely mean it. It should be required looking for every single school system. And if people in this room haven't seen it, you should see it. Because it's all there, you know. So what happens is you get a social system in which a deal is sort of struck. We'll let a few people be creative. You know, keep on working in this area. An elite. Be creative and keep working in this area. But for the mass of people, we've got to put them in a highly restrictive situation so that they will agree to be basically robotic. And that's what happened during the industrial era in Western Europe. Didn't happen in Africa, didn't happen in Asia, didn't happen, you know, in the Pacifica, or Antarctica, or Arctic. But it happened in Western Europe and mostly in North America. And what happened was that, you know, a large number of people were simply relegated to a kind of imprisonment almost to produce something that would create a materially beneficial society. And I just want to say one little word about that, and then I'll come into the modern age. One of the things about these few creative people who were allowed to function throughout the industrial period, who created the new machines, who created the new ideas, who were they? How were they treated? Well, it's sort of interesting. Number one, a bunch of them came from elite schools. And if you look at the curriculum of elite schools in the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, you would be shocked. I don't know if any of you know what the curriculum was here in Europe for elite schools. But nothing like anything you dream of. Not science, not math, not biology, not really history, but Greek and Latin, and Greek composition and Latin composition. What did you do if you were a high school student? You wrote Latin poems and Greek poems, and you read Latin literature and Greek literature and philosophy and stuff like that. But this was wonderful. It was the absolute useless education, right? It had absolutely no relationship to the real functioning world out there, but it created people who basically had their minds free. You know, and all you're doing is doing Greek poetry and Latin poetry. You go out into the world, you go, hey, I can make a machine. You know, I haven't been burdened with all this nonsense, algebra, trigonometry. You know, I wonder what this is like. And then you go out and make machines. And the second interesting thing, and this is a theory that I will just float here because I believe in it very strongly, is I think a similar theory explains, not quite the same as the elite theory, a similar kind of theory explains why the United States kept the lead and has in fact widened this lead in the number of creative people that it has in the population, despite the fact that it has all these oppressive schools. And my theory of this, which I will share with you, is that it's because our schools are so bad, with quotes, right? Everybody knows this. I mean, what do we read in the newspapers? Europeans have better schools, right? French have better schools, the Germans have better schools, the Japanese have better schools. They all have better schools because all of their kids do better on tests, all of their kids learn the same thing, all of their kids are right up there, they know all the facts, they know this, they know that, and look at our kids, they aren't doing as well as all these other countries, and I say, bravo, that's the answer to the question, of course. You know, we have a lot of kids in our school system who are zoned out. You know, they don't pay attention. They're not as serious as the poor Western European Japanese students, you know? And so they sort of float their way through school one way or another, you know? And then they come out the other end and they say, okay, now what am I going to do with my life? Hey, let's build a new kind of car. You know? Let's invent an airplane. Now we come to post-industrial era, where we are today. And in the post-industrial era, these survival traits that nature has given us are really the key survival mechanisms for the human race as adults. Every one of these. The kind of economy we have today absolutely demands that people be good model builders. That's another way of saying creative. But I'd like to say it this way. That people be able to look at things, adapt to new realities, adapt to change, look at situations that are unusual, be flexible. All of these are different ways of saying, hey, come into new situations, be curious about them, build new models, be free, let your mind expand and be free to do original things. That's the bread and butter of the post-industrial age. That's what everybody's talking about. What does retraining mean? Retraining doesn't mean to turn a welder into a bricklayer. That's not what retraining means. Retraining now, when people start talking about it, means to take somebody and make them able to solve problems, to work independently, to have initiative, to do things that they were never taught to do in school. And this now becomes this is a must for survival in the post-industrial age. And it's a little hard to talk about this in this room, because we're all in a transition period. All, the adults in this room, we've all grown up in a transition period. And in that transition period, I hear this all the time from adults. Well, I don't know, I don't work for somebody who allows creativity. I mean, if I'm creative, my boss sees me out of the office. And a lot of people who say that are right. Because this is a period of transition. This whole thing is just a generation old. So sure, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, you still do have a lot of corporations and a lot of work situations where people are still industrial in their concept. But we're talking about our children. We're not talking about us. We're either a lost cause or we're not a lost cause. But for us, it's too late. But for our children, there's no question what they're walking into. All this stuff is gone. They have to be able to meet reality day by day in a flexibility that is something unheard of in our experience. They have to be artists at life. That's what they have to be. They have to really be able to respond with complete compassion to the reality around them and complete understanding. Interactions with the physical world become terribly important. It's terribly important for people in the post-industrial age to feel confident about themselves, about their bodies, about their mobility, about their ability to stand up to the work that they have to do, about their strength, about everything else associated with the physical side of their reality. Everybody writes about that now. We're all struggling with it. Interaction with people, now there I want to really focus. The post-industrial age is an age of freedom, freedom in markets, freedom in political situations. The post-industrial age is moving inexorably towards a universal acceptance of democracy, on one form or another, of individual liberty, of individual rights, and of communities set up through a collection of mutually respecting individuals who take each other's concerns into account. That's where we're headed. Everything indicates that we're headed in that direction. All of the tremendous programs that we have going in our society, whether it's for racial equality, for gender equality, for equality of opportunity in economic class, all the things that are going over in the entire world are focused on this reality. That the future is one in which a society of equals who can interact with each other with mutual respect is going to be the norm. That's a tough one. That's a tough one, as everybody knows who deals with trying to overcome all of the misfortunes, let's say, of people who have been oppressed. That's really a tough one. To get to that kind of a society is something that is hard to transition. And we're going to have to bear that in mind when we talk about the school years. But I want to point out that this isn't only a political matter. This is also an economic matter. People who are now working with the largest corporations in the world, the management consultants and the accountants and so forth, are all coming up with the same conclusions. That in order to stay competitive, every corporation, every company has to work on decentralizing decision-making process and on according much more respect and much more voice and empowerment to the various people working in its various sections. Companies that work on a hierarchical scheme are doomed. People understand that. CEOs understand that. CEOs of AT&T and of GM and of Ford understand that. And it's the pressing problem of the day, but it's right up front and center. How to decentralize decision-making so that even within an enormous corporation, what you essentially have is a collection of groups of individuals who treat each other with mutual respect, are empowered to make decisions, and have an actual say in what the mission of the company is. Okay, let's go to our last chapter now. Let's look at the transition years. We have a situation where we have one thing in infancy, we have one thing in post-industrial adulthood. It almost points at where you have to be in the middle. Let's look at it one by one. You start out with curious infants who are fabulous model builders and are eager to do this all the time. Eager to learn, eager to build models, eager to understand the world all the time. You want to end up with adults who haven't lost this one bit, who haven't lost the ability to play, who haven't lost the ability to be creative, who haven't lost the flexibility that they have, that light in their eyes that they had when they were little children. And what are you going to do in the middle years? What choice do you have? You've got to let them continue being what they were so that they will continue being what they were into adulthood. How can you do otherwise? How can you expect a child who is all of these things as an infant, and you want him to be all these things as an adult, to transition from one to another in an environment where his curiosity is suppressed, where somebody else's agenda is put in front of his agenda, where outside assessments are placed instead of the internal feedback and reevaluation that's part of every creative process? How could you expect to go from here to here if the middle is so corrupt? You have no choice. The only thing you can gain out of shutting this down in infants is adults with whom most of it's shut down. From sheer habit of 12 years, or 15, or 18. Nowadays you can go do a PhD and have this shut down. So, number one, you have a demand on this, as I see it, on this transition period. Kids have to be left to their devices. The wonderful devices that brought them from birth to the age of 3 or 4, where they can walk, they can talk, they can communicate with other kids, they can play with other kids, they can organize activities, they can concentrate, they can focus. Leave them alone. Leave them alone. They figure out for themselves what's important. You don't have to tell them that reading is important. You don't have to tell them, you didn't have to tell them speaking was important. Is that what you did when they were 1? Talk! It's important. You'll never get anywhere if you don't know how to talk. Do you sit there and say, and there are parents, I mean, to show you the absurdity to which developmental psychology is going, there are parents who actually worry if their kid, they know the book says the kid's supposed to say their first words at what, I don't know, 11 months or whatever, right? Oh my God, my kid's a year and a month and hasn't said a word. Got to, do something. Let's get some remedial speech therapy going on in here. Some people do worry about that. Most parents haven't gotten that far, but people are working on it. And the same thing with reading. You don't have to tell them, they'll understand if it's really important. A lot of stuff we tell them are important isn't. We're lying. We're lying. Last night on the radio show, trigonometry came up. What a joke. Can you imagine when the last time anybody that if they're not engineers or physicists, which I'm a physicist so I can talk. If you're not professionals, when was the last time you went to your friend and said, something? What is cosecant squared plus secant squared? I don't have a handle on it. Really important. They're lying. They're just plain lying. And let me tell you something else. I don't think a second language is that important. I'm bilingual. I think it's great. I think people who have 2 languages, 3 languages, it's a wonderful skill. But everybody wants to learn English. Why does everybody want to learn English? Let's see if we can figure this out. Because just about everything important is being done or translated into English. Well, if everything important all around the world, you know, what is a Japanese scientist who make a great discovery publish in Japanese? Don't make me laugh. He publishes in English. And so does the Finnish scientists, and the Hungarian, and the Slovakian, and the Romanian, and the Italian. Of course they have their own journals. But the only thing they print in their own journals is stuff that they couldn't get printed in English. You don't really need 2 languages. I'm not against 2 languages. I'm just against the lie that it's absolutely essential if you're going to grow up in the modern world, which is a global village, that you have to learn more than 1 language. Anyway, what language?
Which one?
Which one? You know, there's like, what, 10,586 languages? Which one? Well, I'd like to learn, you know, New Guinea language of the New Guinea natives in this valley. Oh, you can't do that. That's an important language. You know, but for me it's important. That's what I'm going to spend my life with. Okay. Let's look at interactions with the physical world. This is such a big one. They start out just so excited about reaching out to everything around them. As adults, we want them to continue. We want them to ski. We want them to rollerblade. We want them to go outside. We want them to enjoy the outdoors, take hikes, take walks. That's the kind of adults we want. We're proud of that kind of thing, right? What do we want from them in the middle, for God's sake? To sit them down in rooms? What is going on with people? What insanity. What does a kid like better than to be free to move? And what do we do to kids today in this transition period who want to move around? We label them hyperactive, and we drug them. This is not a joke. This is a tragedy. This is a tragedy. My father tells a wonderful story when he was a country hick. And yeah, he grew up in the country, in upstate New York on a farm. You know, the stories he tells of his childhood are perfect country hick stories. That, you know, we never washed our clothes. We washed our socks is that when they stood up when we took them off. That's when we washed our socks. That's his story of his childhood. You know, son, he went to a one-room schoolhouse, which of course was what I'm talking about, you know, bad school. Everybody did whatever they wanted. They hung out and everything, you know. Then he came to New York City when he was 13 years old, and he says he'll never forget his first day in class. Because he went to this first classroom, and everybody was sitting. So he sat down in a chair. And then about 3 minutes later, he got up and he moved to another chair. And then about 3 minutes later, he got up and moved to another chair. And after he did it the 4th time, the teacher walked over to him, cocked his head and said, "Greenberg, you look normal." You just did something, you know, he was just being him, you know? People want to move. Kids want to move. What normal kid wants to sit in a chair? Unless he's sitting in front of a very exciting video game, in which case leave him alone. Then you don't have to worry about it. Okay? Very important. Freedom of motion. To us, the openness of the campus is just as essential and just as critical as everything else. The freedom of people to move around and to do what they want at any given time with their physical beings, that same freedom is integral into this survival mechanism that I'm talking about, which is that you should be free to maneuver in your environment in order to interact with it. And finally, interaction with people. And that is where I want to end the evening's discussion, or at least this part of it. There's a student in our school by the name of Ben Day, who's 17, a very, very bright student, and he was in a parent discussion group one day, and people were talking about the school. And they asked him, what was the most important feature of the school for him? Was it, they asked, this was a parent asking, was it your freedom to choose whatever you wanted to learn or study or do with your day? And he said, that's not it at all. He said, I could stay home for that kind of freedom. He was over the minimum, you know, he was over the required age. He said, I could stay home for that. If I stayed home, I could certainly read or do whatever I want all day. That isn't the key. The key, he said, is the democratic structures of the school. And I thought about that a lot, because I had never heard a student say that. And I had gotten so tired of saying that myself to blank faces that I had stopped saying it, you know? And he brought me back to reality, because he explained what he meant, and I understood what he meant afterwards even better. What he was saying was that it was essential to his development to be in an environment where he was treated with complete respect as an individual. That's what he meant by a democratic, or that's what we mean by a democratic environment. This to him was the key. Not patronized, not being bullied by adults, not being bullied by anybody, but having structures in place which guaranteed him full voice in his own school, in his own environment, full voice in running it. The school meeting in a Sudbury model school is the school, basically. It's what runs the school. It spends the money. It draws up the budget. It decides all the rules. It authorizes every dollar spent. It eventually, maybe not in the very first year, when there is no school until the school gets going, but eventually hires the staff, fires the staff. It does all the judicial proceedings, one way or another. The democratic structure is central to the school, and what it said to Vende is what it says to every student in the school from age 4 and up. You have a voice. You are as empowered in this school, you are as respected in this school as every other individual, regardless of age, gender, or whatever. I cannot tell a kid to shut up. I cannot tell a kid to get out of this room. If a kid is bothering me, I can write him up just like he can write me up, and I've gotten written up. I've gotten written up. We all get written up. I left a can of soda out. I got written up for littering. I got off with an easy sentence. I got off with a warning the first time. Next time I have to do the trash. It's not a joke. The kids understand this. This isn't a joke. They understand that I cannot treat them any differently than they can treat me or each other. And this atmosphere of respect and equality is really the underpinning for all the rest. Because there's no meaning to a society in which kids are free to choose what they can do with their minds, but not equally empowered in what they do during the day. You understand? It's a contradiction. I can't be a principal and say, okay, when it comes to spending money, I'll make the decisions. When it comes to allotting rooms, I'll make the decisions. But you can do whatever you want with your time. Kids understand what that means. What that means is I'm the boss. And I have now given you the privilege of doing something with your time. But I could withdraw that because I'm the king. You understand? Because really I'm the king. It's only when I say the way we said in this country, there is no king. Period. There is no king. The only way to get something done is through the mutual cooperation of equal people who respect each other equally. That's central. You can't have it any other way. You can't, that's not a piece of the picture. It's the heart of the picture. And that's why the democratic structures of the school are absolutely integral to the school. Drop one of them, you might as well drop the rest, as far as I'm concerned. You might as well have, if you just have one person, okay, I can understand that. I remember when we first were incorporated, somebody said, how can you give financial decisions to the school meeting? He's a Yankee. And I tell this story over and over again. Hannah probably has heard it until it comes out of her ears, This Yankee, this wonderful old Yankee lawyer walking up and pacing up and down the room saying, 4-year-olds making decisions on money, Jesus Christ! How can you allow something like that to happen? And he wasn't being, disrespectful to Christianity. He was a church-going Christian, but he just couldn't see it. 4-year-olds. They'll spend all the money on candy. They'll just waste it all. That was central. 4-year-olds know it. You will see it in your school, and it's something to see. Any of you who have been at our school and visited have seen in our school. The biggest thrill is to walk through the halls and have children age 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 look you straight in the eye. They never avert their faces. Try walking into a regular school as an adult. You're the enemy. They look you straight in the eye, they say hi, they say, how are you today if you say, how are you? 4 or 5-year-olds. You kid around with them, they kid around with you. They don't think they know as much about life as I do, but neither do the 40-year-olds. I'm old. So I gotta line up on everybody. Does that mean I should have 2 votes? Maybe you should go that way, actually. Maybe you should have votes equal to the number of years. 4-year-olds have 4 votes, 5-year-olds have 5 votes. But then I would run the place, practically. Almost run it. Joni would have more votes than I, and that would be a problem. The democratic structures of the school are absolutely central to it. And that's the note on which I should finish by saying it's obvious, and I sort of left that out, that if you have a school in the transition period, then the adults that you're going to get, of course, are adults for whom this is. I mean, people have come to our school, and on all of these outsiders, they'll sometimes come to these questions. What's the gender situation in your school? What's the gender situation? Is there? And you're looking at it. What do you mean? I mean, well, do girls get treated differently than boys and this and that? Because, are they encouraged to do this or that? And it's like we're talking a different language. What are you talking about? I don't even know what you're talking about. I don't think of people as girls and boys. That's not even a category for us. I mean, there are girls who play basketball and climb trees, and there are boys who play with dolls, and who cares? What's it about? Okay. With that, I think I will, I think I'll leave anything else that I want to say to questions and answers, and maybe we should take a 5-minute break. Thank you.
Maybe just give a little bit of an example of what your day-to-day school day consists of for a child that's attending in this kind of environment.
We really shy away from that because I'm not going to avoid the answer, but I'm going to start by saying we really shy away from that because it's essentially the same question as saying, can you give me some idea, a day-to-day example of what the life of people in Joliet is like? And the answer is everybody's doing something different, right? But I mean, they all get up in the morning, presumably, and they all go to sleep at night, and they all eat. But aside from that, it's hard. So in a sense, I can't, because they're all doing different things, and they're not necessarily doing consistently the same thing day after day. I can make a few generalizations. One of which is that the odds are that younger kids will be doing what we identify as play most of the day, what we call playing, and it is playing. It is playing, but it doesn't have any stigma in our school. We're very excited. Give you an example. We had this reporter, with the no rules. She actually got a lot of it. And she was completely blown away because she walked into one room where there were a group of 5- and 6-year-olds and maybe a 7-year-old, in that age. There must have been about 6 of them who were playing the most elaborate game with dolls that you could possibly imagine. And when she asked them, well, what are you doing? And I guess it was Barbies, and you'll excuse me, I'm not really up on this, but so they were having a wedding. But they were waiting for the groom. They were waiting for another girl to bring Ken, I guess, male Barbie or something. And this was so serious. I mean, they were dressing the bridesmaids, and I mean, they were dressing this, they were arranging the whole wedding ceremony. And they had to cancel it in the end because the girl who was supposed to bring Ken never showed up. It blew the person's mind because here's what I'm talking about. This was like an intense, focused, serious activity. They were having fun, but it was very meaningful to them. It was not a child's game. And one of the most aggravating things that I've ever seen was a psychology book that was written about 15 years ago by an otherwise very perceptive Scotsman who went on and on about the virtues of play. And that's the first half of his book. And he just described all these wonderful aspects of play and the wonderful things of play. And I thought, finally, I found a psychologist who really is into this and understands it. And of course, I get like to page 50 or 55 or 60, and he says, and this is all wonderful for kids up to the age of 9 or 10. And then when they hit 9 or 10, of course, they've got to stop this kind of activity and get into the more serious things like, algebra and trigonometry. And it was sad for me because play is elaborate, play is complex, and it goes on really through all the years. When you get to slightly older ages, what dominates more and more is conversation. Pure conversation, not encumbered with physical play. So what you will often see, I mean, I'm giving you real broad generalizations here, okay? So what you'll see teenagers often doing is spending huge amounts of time talking to each other. And this is, again, I mean, this is the plug-in thing that I was talking about before. It's so clear if you're a fly on the wall and listen in on these conversations what they're about. And of course then when they leave school after they've talked all day, they're on the phone at home and they talk till 2 in the morning, then they come in the next day and they talk. And we always have a standing joke that when the kids go on a camping trip, you know, what do they do on the camping trip? They talk all night, you know, because they haven't had a chance to talk. All they've been doing all year has been talking. But again, this is something that that you have to give a lot of thought to, and you realize, I mean, you see a teenage girl calling up a friend of hers to ask what she's going to be wearing, what the friend is going to be wearing to the party tomorrow night. A typical kind of a phone call. And you'll see a conversation on that subject going on between these teenage girls for hours. And they might call up other friends to check and so forth. And I know what my attitude towards things like that was when I was in my former life. You know, I mean, this is absurd. You know, talk about wasting time, doing silly things. What could be more absurd than silly little teenage girls telling each other about what they're going to wear to another party? But of course, that's not what's happening at all. This is part of this very, very complicated and elaborate process of understanding socialization. You know, what does it mean? What is the and that's what they're really talking about. What are the implications of wearing this? And what are people going to think? And what are the friends going to think? And how's that going to make them appear? And what they're doing is trying to build this social model, and that's a long, tedious process. They've got to spend a lot of time on the phone, a lot of time with their friends, and it's a very serious kind of thing, and it's no less serious and no less meaningful than a bunch of adult males talking about a stock swap, you know, and a takeover, which is just as silly if you think about it. You know? I can't answer it any better than that. They're each doing different things. Most of the time, they're not doing anything that you could identify as an activity that would be seen in a traditional school. Let's say that right up front, because most of the activities that go on in traditional schools don't have much relevance to kids' needs. That's all I can say.
How long is the school day?
I'm sorry?
How long is the school day?
Well, we open at 8:30. I mean, in our particular school, we open at 8:30, we close at 5. And with a release form, they can come a little earlier and stay a little later. But they can come any 5 hours during that, or any of the whole time. They have to come by Massachusetts law 5 hours, up to the age of 16, which is their responsibility, but that's... So it's a long day, and a lot of kids come, they never want to go home, they don't want to go home on weekends, they hate holidays, they're too busy. I haven't satisfied you, so I'm going to give you another shot.
Let me just ask about a slightly different area, maybe the same area. With what you said about the curiosity and the play process, and the things that I'm thinking about just going back to my own childhood, one of the natural things that came from playing was you ask questions like, well, what makes this work? You know, how does a car work, or how does a battery work? And the first thing a kid wants to do is take it apart and see what's inside of it. And, you know, I have some explanation for what's in there and why it's doing what it's doing.
They're doing that all day. Okay. They're doing that all day. With adults, with their peers, with kids a little older. See, I didn't talk about something like you can only stress so many things in one evening. Age mixing is a huge thing in our school. You know, in one of our publications, we call it our secret weapon. It's a tremendous thing, because that's just the kind of thing that goes on all the time. And what's beautiful, if I can digress for a minute about this in answer to your question, what's beautiful about age mixing is that it enables kids to interact with people who are somewhat ahead of them, but not so far ahead of them that they're not really in the same mental sphere. See, part of the trouble of adults interacting, well, there's a wonderful story. with my brother's child. Was it Rafi or Eitan? With one of my brother's children who came to him one day and said, he was 7 or 8, said, "Daddy, where do I come from?" And my brother's sort of uptight, and he was dreading this birds and bees thing, all his life, just hoping it wouldn't happen, and finally this kid comes and asks him. So he takes a deep breath and gives him this whole long, it's very pedantic, explanation about seed and this and that and all the rest. And the end of the whole thing, he looks at me and he says, "Daddy, don't be silly, John comes from New York. Where do I come from?" and the point of that story, is it's an archetypal story, because as adults, our world isn't as geared into the 7-year-olds as the 9-year-olds is. No matter how hard we try, no matter how good we are at it, So the 7-year-old benefits tremendously, not only from other 7-year-olds who are exchanging the same degree of misinformation usually, but from the 8 and 9-year-olds who have a new kind of misinformation. And it's a very fruitful thing, because they're constantly dealing. This kind of conversation goes on all the time. And what you have to do, you meaning me, not you, but what one has to do in a school like that is respect these conversations. And that's tremendously important. It's the same respect we were talking about. And I'll tell you what I mean. If these two gentlemen are having a conversation, right, and let's say they're talking about some aspect of economics, right, and I happen to walk by, and I just happen to overhear it. And what I hear is this gentleman saying something that I know to be wrong. It's just plain wrong. He just got it wrong. I would not stop. I'm walking by, right? And they're having a conversation. I wouldn't say, "Oh, excuse me, that is stupid." You've got it all backwards. Now, let me explain to you how it really is. Never happened. Never. I know very few adults who are that rude, and those that are that rude don't have a lot of friends. But we always do it with kids. We always do it with kids. And what you have to treat kids like adults. You have to have the same discipline. If I walk by kids, and it happens all the time. I hear one 9-year-old explaining to a 7-year-old, very elaborately, how this and this works, and of course it's totally wrong. It would never occur to me. Now, if the 7-year-old comes to me and says, "Is it right?" I may, I'll tell him the truth, what I think. I never hold back. But if he hasn't asked my opinion, I figure, hey, when he's 9, he'll ask an 11-year-old. When he's 11, he'll ask and eventually he'll probably get the right story. And, I learned that lesson very early from my son here, who used to have who when he was very young, had somebody whom he admired, who actually lives in this area now and works as a chemist in a government laboratory, whom he admired very much, who was 5 years older than he was. And whenever he had a question of physics, I'm a physicist, okay? I taught physics at university level. I've written physics, okay? Whenever he had a question about physics, he'd go to Ernie, right? Never to me. One day he came to me and said, "Would you explain this and this to me?" And I explained it to him. He said, "That's wrong." I said, "Michael, what do you mean that's wrong? Ernie says it's different." Ernie's right. And that's when I learned, that there's no competing with the Ernies of this world. Just leave him alone, and eventually either he'll figure it out or he'll forget the question. Okay. Yes.
I had a question. I was here with a young woman from Germany, and so I'm kind of asking, I have one question for myself and one for her. She's not in here right now. But anyway, about...
Are you going to translate the answer?
Yes. She knows English, but her question was your comment on languages, and that was, from her viewpoint, of course she's multilingual, but she sees it as extremely helpful in that at a younger age, when you learn a language or a couple of different languages, it's real beneficial and much more difficult to learn it later on. And so just that's one example of an area where then what do you do? Just let the child choose not to learn a language, and she kind of disagreed with the fact that you only needed to know English because around the world you can get to know a culture much better than the actual language. So.
You know why I'm smiling. I mean, these are all judgment calls.
Yeah.
These are all somebody's judgment calls. Listen, she can learn as many languages as she wants. It doesn't bother me. And, I've learned a bunch of languages because I like language. This is not the issue. This is not, the issue is whether you can decide that something is so essential that you can force other people to do it and not trust that they will come to the same conclusion that you have, that it's essential to do it on their own. That's what the issue is. And that's this fundamental control issue in any autocracy or democracy or whatever. I mean, you have people who say, I can give you a million similar examples. You know, Mozart started playing piano when he was, or violin, or God knows, or both, when he was 3. You know, and probably, you know, if you start playing, Suzuki thinks that, you know, you start playing when you're 3 or 4, you become a good violinist. And probably it's true. And probably if people learn a lot of languages, it's true. And all that stuff. But so what? So I mean, where that leads to is the kind of pressure cooker that some parents put their kids into, that is, to me, a major tragedy. You know, the parents who produce geniuses by putting them in this situation at a very early age, and they know music, they know 6 languages, they've learned math, they've learned this, they've learned that, by the age of 4 they know it all. And there's a very interesting story about that, actually, and it's a very tragic story. I don't know how many of you know the name of, which I've now slipped my mind. Norbert Wiener, thank you, who was the father of cybernetics, which is the science that founded all of computer science. He was a world-famous mathematician and logician who flourished in the 30s and 40s, and he was truly one of the great geniuses of this century, if not of many centuries. And he was known to be, I mean, he was a tremendous genius. Everything he wrote was spectacular, and he really founded the whole theory of computers single-handed. He was a miserable man. He was a child prodigy. His parents had decided to make him a prodigy at an early age. Okay, and he knew 4 or 5 different languages, including Latin and Greek, by the age of 4. He knew math, advanced math, all this kind of stuff. I don't know, a whole bunch of other stuff. He never got married. He spent every afternoon in a movie house, you know, to while away the afternoons. And he said in no uncertain terms when he was asked, you know, well, here you are, one of the most famous men in history. You know, aren't you grateful? Don't you feel grateful to your parents? He said unequivocally, I would have given all of this up for happiness. Now, this brings us to a really important question, which I don't want to bypass, and that is, how do we measure success? What do we call a successful life? And what did we call a successful school? And this is something everybody has to grapple with personally, not just for their kids, but for yourself. I mean, you're not going to decide it for your kids anyway. The long and the short is, ultimately, they're going to decide it for themselves when they grow up. But you've got to decide it for yourself. And every single human being has to come up with an answer. My answer is for me, and your answer is for you, and your answer is for you. I can't dictate the answer to everybody. For some people, a successful life is a life in which there's a lot of achievement, a lot of recognition, the Nobel Prize. For other people, it's a lot of money, a lot of wealth. For other people, it's a whole gamut of things. It's holiness, spirituality. Everybody has their own goal. But one thing I'm sure of, there's no single answer to that question. That's an individual question to everybody. What a school like a Sudbury Valley School does is allow each child to formulate that question for themselves as they start growing up. What is it that I want to call a successful life for myself? And so by the time they leave the school, like at 17, 18, they've already started grappling with that question. Of course, they'll keep grappling with it all their lives, but they're used to thinking about it. Because that's what they're thinking about. What do I want to do with my life? And I cannot begin to understand an educational system that will seek to put one answer to that question. That the successful life is a person who is a well-rounded education, who knows 10,000 facts about American history, who's read these and these major books, and this. What kind of an approach is that even? Sure, I mean, you want to do all that, that's great. You consider that a successful life, you have my blessing. But that's your decision. What authority gives somebody the right to make that decision for the whole population? It's absurd and runs counter to everything we believe in, everything the world is going to, and the only people who have that kind of arrogance are academicians and educators, nobody else.
No, one more question. That was on I don't know what Sudbury Valley's attitude is, or how you do television and video games. And so I just wanted your opinion on television and video games as far as how it relates to education? Say, if you have a child in a homeschooling situation, and what you have found in children.
Homeschool, wait a minute, I'm confused.
Well, I mean, or in a situation where they just have free time and you're allowing them to choose what they want to do.
Well, I don't want to gloss over that because I really don't want to talk about homeschooling situations because that's not. You have to understand that a person who's in a Sudbury Valley type school is in a particular social setting right off the bat, and they behave differently than they behave in situations where they're in other social settings. So I don't want to generalize from one to the other. All I can tell you is there's no activity in our school that is considered better or worse than any other activity. There never has been, there never will be. And again, to that, that's a very broad answer. And I'm always interested in the way people I'm not saying this is you, but the way people grapple with this kind of question. You get people in a standard educational setting, and if I bring them into a room in Sudbury Valley, and there's 5 kids sitting there, and they're all reading books, right? They can spend 2 solid months every day reading stupid children's books, right? You know what I'm talking about? You know what a stupid children's book is? Like 80% of them, right? Mealy-mouthed nonsense, okay? But they're children's books. They're published very nicely by children's publishers and specialists, you know. Emma learns about motherhood, you know, all that stuff. And they're reading that day after day, and there isn't one person with a traditional educational background who won't say, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? Look, they're reading up to age level, and they're reading on their right appropriate level, and they're reading, and they're doing something academic. That's wonderful. But you take the same group of kids, you know, and you'll have them excitedly sitting in front of the latest 3-dimensional, multi-dimensional sound, bang, this, that, blasting video game, you know, which has just come off the press, and they've just stuck it into the machine, you know, and they're playing this intensely and trying to understand what makes it work and why this is better than the last video game and what's the new tricks that these people have finally come up with. Oh, this is mind-numbing. Mind-numbing? Mind-numbing? Which of these 2 activities is mind-numbing? You tell me. You know, and it's the same kind of thing. So you get a video. I mean, I have it with any activity. All you have to do. What if I tell you that this kid who's playing video games is going to go on to be, you know, the next Bill Gates? Oh. That's different, right? You see? Or the same thing. Any of you have read Free at Last, the story in there, that in a way I wish I hadn't put in, because it's all people talk about is the fishing story. You know, the kid who fishes. But there's a piece of that story, I don't remember it anymore if it's in the book or not, but what I used to tell the parent also, in addition to anything else, was, and what if this kid became a world-famous fishing guide? You know, would you mind? Or what if he wrote I guess I do say it, you know, what if he wrote, would anybody complain? Wow, this guy's an expert in fishing. Look at all he knows about fish. You know, we don't judge any of that, any of it. And again, there's so many stories. It's the last thing on earth. You watch a kid, the average healthy kid who's free to do what he wants, like in our school. You watch a kid like that watching a video cassette. They're looking for something. Their eyes are open. There's nothing numb about their mind. You might not want to look at it. It might not interest you. Hey, look, I went to Star Wars with Max and with Hannah. Hannah and I are the only 2 people in the country who didn't see the first version. Okay? I felt finally I had to see it. You know, now to me, I can't relate to it personally, but this obviously changed the generation. So am I going to say this is nonsense? Yeah.
My friend who left has a question, and her question is, I know the kids from your school go to university and college, but do they have a hard time, because often colleges and universities are, you know, just tighter extension of high school?
Well, again, a lot of kids those kids who want to go from our school to colleges and universities.
And they just say,
And they might have, and they say this is what we have to do. Now they might have, most of them will tell you, oh, I had some trouble the first couple of weeks or maybe the first semester because I had to learn how to do this and this. But they uniformly say that they're better adapted to university life than the kids who come from the best prep schools for one simple reason. And it's always the same story. We've heard this from so many graduates. The kids who, no matter how similar a college is to high school, there is a very big difference in the level of responsibility you have to take for your own studies and for your own time when you go to college. It just is. And that transition is very hard for a lot of people to make. That's where a lot of people go off track. From good high schools or good prep schools, they don't know how to organize their time. They don't know how to set priorities. They get carried away with whatever. And our kids have been organizing their time since they were 4, you know? It's just not a problem. Okay, this is what I have to do. I do A, B, C, and D. So they have an easier time in that sense. But I also want to stress another thing. A lot of our kids don't go to college. So what?
No, it's just that if they want
And
to go
the other
into-
thing I want to say is the better the university, the easier to get into. And I guess you can figure that out. Because the universities that are lower on the academic totem pole, which the academics set up for themselves very snobbily, are much more insecure about being accused of not having high standards. And high standards in this society means high SAT scores, good grades. So you come to them with no transcript or no nothing, and sometimes it'll fluster them. But the good schools who are self-confident say, hey, sure, this sounds interesting. Let's stick a flyer on this. Sounds like an interesting person. They'll judge the person on the person and not worry about what it might look like to the Harvard looking over their shoulders, you know, and wondering what a lousy school they are. Yeah.
I don't have a friend next to me that has a
I was
question.
just
I have my own.
some kind of correspondence here.
I would guess that over the last 30 years, Sudbury Valley, the school has evolved and changed over the years.
Not really.
No? Is there any difference now than when the school started?
Yeah, there are more kids. It's nicer. We have an established culture. It